Hello and welcome to M&A's Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and I serve M&A as the Ecosystems Development Director. Every pastor is an interim pastor. That's the opening line from the book Next by William Vanderbloemen. I've repeated that mantra probably more than almost anything else over the past 6 years, and since doing this webinar, several of these webcasts have touched on pastoral transitions, and every time there's interest. Probably because the truth of that saying, every pastor is an interim pastor. See, we all transition, whether we are seeking out a new call or we're called to glory. Yet very few give it much thought. And if we do, our experience is often so limited, we don't know the questions to ask or what guidance we can give to a congregation. And congregations often don't have much expertise in this area and usually are operating out of sense of loss. Well, then there's another question. For those of us who have served for years and are looking for what the next phase of ministry might be, we may not want the full weight of a senior pastor position, but have years ahead to serve and loads of experience. Guiding a church through change would be a great opportunity given the wisdom and skills accrued. Now, the fact is, in my denomination, the Presbyterian Church in America, we speak of stated supply, but we don't really use the term interim pastor. It might be that we imagine that we, pastors and sessions, have all that we need to shift from one pastor to the next, only to find out it's never that easy. Well, I'm pleased to have with us today a number of folks who can serve in this position and for this conversation. Matt Bowling is the Executive Director of Flourish Coaching, who not only works with churches in finding and placing pastors and coaching pastors, he also fills that role himself and did so with there at Columbia Presbyterian Church in Baltimore, Maryland. And with us is Bill Cianella, who was an elder at that church. Bill is also the president of BALM, Baltimore Antioch Leadership Movement, there in the Baltimore, Maryland area. Tom Cox is a teaching elder in North Carolina and served as interim at Kishwaukee Community Church, an EPC church. Got that position through IPM, Interim Pastor Ministry, after serving as pastor of I believe 4 churches over 20 years. He now works with Flourish Coaching as a interim pastor, as well as serving with West Africa Reform Mission. Gary Miles, he's a ruling elder at Kishwaukee Community EPC Church in Illinois. He's a retired systems design engineer working in aerospace and is part of the Personnel Committee and Worship Committee on the session and worked with Tom. Paul Hahn is the interim pastor at Pacific Crossroads Church in LA for the past 2 years. He was a campus minister with RUF and Athletes in Action. He was a church planter in Austin, Texas, and Knoxville, Tennessee, and was the coordinator of Mission North America. He married a Fran for 36 years, has 4 children and 3 granddaughters. And then Sean Osbolt, he is a ruling elder at Pacific Crossroads there in LA. He's active in entrepreneurial business. He's married to Lauren, and they have 2 wonderful daughters. And for those of you that didn't tell me about your wife and daughters, I'm sure they're wonderful and your kids are fine. So we're not going to take anything on that. Well, as we jump in, and those who are attending, want to encourage you, this is meant to be a conversation. So I really encourage you to use the chat box or the Q&A box, throw out your questions. We will try to keep those flowing through and answer those the best that we can. Of course, we're not experts necessarily in the field, but we have some experience and some things to share. All right, let's get started. Let's start with the ruling elders, and let's go ruling elder and then the interim pastor. Sean, if you would just kind of start, just kick us off here. Tell us a little briefly about the church context and what led to hiring an interim pastor.
Sure. Great to be with you all. I'll say this morning here in Los Angeles. So Sean Osbolt, our church, Pacific Crossroads Church in Los Angeles, is a multi-site church. We had about 2,000 folks meeting regularly on Sundays, and we had a very abrupt departure of our senior pastor in February of 2020. So right about a month before the COVID lockdowns happened, which further complicated the situation for our church. And so we went about 8 months with filling the pulpit supply mostly over Zoom because we weren't allowed to meet in person. And so we kind of experimented with both models, with just a pulpit supply model where we were having guest pastors come in and preach on Sundays. And then we're fortunate enough to connect with Paul, and he graciously moved across the country to come serve as an interim pastor, originally for a year, but that's extended to 2 years. And so we're really grateful that Paul's been able to do that, and has really done a great job leading our church through a period of great transition from a smaller congregation coming out of COVID, where we were able to meet in person outdoors, and now back indoors again, and really starting to see some growth and renewal at our church over the last, especially the last 6 months. And so we're really, really grateful to the Lord for that, and happy to be with you all here today.
Oh, great. Good. Thanks. Paul, so tell us about your coming into it, and what was that like for you? What was the experience? And then maybe just real briefly, what was the same and what was different from other pastoral?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for having us. Great to be on with everyone. In my role with Mission in North America, I work with Matt Bowling and others to really want to see interim pastorates begin in fresh ways in the PCA. It's such an inflection point for congregations to consider in a pastoral transition, particularly if there is trauma or an abruptness to it, or even after a long tenured, fruitful ministry. Who are we? What are we about? What is our mission? It's such a vibrant space. For Pacific Crossroads, it was not a space they wanted to enter. It was so difficult with a beloved, incredibly gifted senior leader exiting abruptly, compounded by COVID, as Sean said. So I actually consulted with the leaders, Sean and others, at Pacific Crossroads in my role with M&A, and really felt a unique, almost a Damascus Road kind of call in a worship service in September of 20, that I sensed the Lord was calling Fran and I to come here. Fran didn't necessarily agree with that right away, but the Lord moved in her heart as well. And we spent a month working with M&A to figure out an exit. And we started coming on the weekends in November of 20, and then moved out here in January of 21. I'll just say this, for those, maybe some of our audience who are pastors thinking about, is this a role for me? I know you're going to get more to that, but I had always wondered in my heart what it would be like to be an interim pastor, because one of my great challenges in all the ministry roles I've had is wanting people to think I'm a hero, wanting people to think that that I'm just the greatest thing since sliced bread. And it really mitigates against that for your own soul coming into this space, because you are certainly an intermediate to a short-term person. And you just sort of have the freedom in ministry to say, how can I help? How can I serve? How can I give my best in this season for these people in the mission of Christ in this place? And so I have found it incredibly freeing and a resetting for me as we look to seasons ahead in ministry.
Great. Well, good. Well, Bill, there at Columbia Presbyterian Church, and on the other side of the other coast. Tell us a little bit about your context. What led you to bring on, consider an interim, and how did that go?
Okay, just to give a little example, we're in Columbia, which is about 20 miles southwest of Baltimore and about 20 miles north of Washington, D.C. in Howard County, which, according to some stats, is anywhere between the third and fifth richest county in the United States, but it is also a county of many cultures. We have a large Asian population and multicultural population. We're a church of about 400 to 500 people, members, and our pastor abruptly left, went on a sabbatical, and never came back. It caught everybody off guard. It was compounded by the fact of what was going on in our nation at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021, became very clear that our pastor's views were not compatible with our session views. He went on sabbatical in June of 2021, and for a supposed 3-month sabbatical, and we found out a month later that he was not coming back. So there was the congregation was in shock, and in addition, there were a lot of confusion and a lot of division because of what was preached and things said from the pulpit, and we immediately came to a conclusion that we needed an interim pastor, more than just people coming to fill the pulpit, but an interim pastor who could bring healing and renewal and help the session to heal and work with one another and extend that to the congregation. In my work with BALM, which is BALM is a ministry that our mission is to develop cross-cultural disciples who will disciple others in Baltimore and beyond. And one of the things we do in BALM is church renewal to churches who are trying to adapt to their changing neighborhoods and changing culture. And in that, we had worked with Flourish before. So even though I hadn't met Matt, I was very familiar with Flourish. And so when we went the interim pastor route, we immediately contacted Flourish because they were able to help us with not only the interim pastor, but the healing and renewal that our church needed.
Yeah, oh, good. And that's a great reminder that, you know, every church in transition is to some degree a church in trauma. But as that trauma increases, the pain increases even more so. Take aware of that. Matt, before you jump in, Matt Bowling with Flourish, and again, just always by a full disclosure, both Paul and I are on Matt's board, and so while we do not profit monetarily from having him on in any way, although we might want to talk to you about that, Matt, at some point down the road.
I knew that was coming.
But no, just that we have definitely a prior relationship there. So yeah, Matt, tell us about your connection with Columbia and what was, what stood out, what was unique in that relationship.
Yeah, so I would say that I've had an interest as executive director of Flourish in interim pastoring for several years. One of the linked ministries that'll be in the show notes is a group called Vital Church, and I've had and Paul has as well had a lot of good crossover with those brothers who was much to be appreciated there. It's Vital Church is just the best work in interim pastoring. I'm happy to promote them because they do great work. They're also intentionally small, and they have not worked in the PCA, and so something that would help PCA churches have a resource for interim pastoring is one of the reasons I was interested as an executive director. With CPC, Columbia Presbyterian Church, we started with them just doing some work coaching the church that quickly moved into an interim pastor sort of position because it became obvious that the church needed more help than simply working from the outside, which Flourish does with a lot of churches, but they needed help that was on the inside. And I think that help was needed, and Bill can correct me if he'd stated it differently. I think the session needed help because it was divided. The staff needed help because they had some challenges, and the congregation needed help because they were also divided. So that's a common reason. Common reason for an interim pastorate is just division, lack of clarity moving forward. And the Lord's been kind to deliver much more of that, particularly at the session and the staff, and moving towards the congregation. So we're thankful.
Yeah.
That answer your question?
Just remind me a little bit in the context of a church like a marriage. There are definitely times where the couples can't counsel each other.
Yeah.
You need that interim is that outside voice.
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I found in doing some work with the session, this would have been in January of this year. So I'm still at CPC actually, and will be, it looks like till maybe June of next year. I think that one of the things that I found was that the session knew it needed help, and they were responsive to me helping them.
That's great.
And I think that that's part of what's needed in terms of interim pastoring is, one, we need help. Two, you're the person we'd like you to help us. And that, I think that happened with CPC, or else I wouldn't have been there. Because people did ask me, why do you want to, even inside CPC, people ask me, why do you want to do this? And I'm like, because I think that the session wants to respond to me leading them. And so, yeah.
I think it was a blessing. Myself and one other member of session both have senior executive experience. I'm a retired senior executive, and the other is a current. And we came to the conclusion very quickly that we needed help, and internally, it even though we had some of this experience that we've used in corporate America, we needed much more than what we had. And I like Matt's illustration. When a marriage has difficulty, regardless if it's of your experiences in life, you need outside help many times to bring things to bear. And we came to the conclusion very quickly, we need outside help. And we didn't look very hard. We went right to Flourish because, as I mentioned, we've been using Flourish in other churches in Balm, and we benefited greatly so far. We benefited so much we extended back for another 6 months to make sure nobody else took them.
Oh, good. Yeah, Gary, there in Illinois, just down the road from me. Tell us about your context and situation and how you hooked up with Tom.
Yeah, we're in the middle of the country. Our church is a little bit different. We're a small church, maybe 250 members. Sunday worship's maybe half that. Our pastor was with us for about 6 years, but his wife had been battling cancer that whole time. And in fall of 2020, she went home to be with the Lord. They had our pastor had 3 small kids. Try as we might to try to help him, support him. He really needed family around, so he ended up taking. Actually, the Lord just provided a call for him back home in Nebraska. But that left us a couple things. Our church was not in trauma, I would say, but definitely grieving. Right? We loved him as a pastor, and so there was a lot of emotion going on there. We, for a while, went about filling the pulpit with elders. We have done it in the past. This is, I think, in the last 20 some years, we've had 4 interims, and we have gone periods of time where we have filled the pulpit ourselves. But it's not the same thing as having a pastor. And so we are strong believers in interim pastors, helping churches through transitions of all different kinds. And churches have a lot of reasons for needing a transitional pastor or someone who can come in and just kind of help that church move forward. So yeah, our experiences have been excellent through the years. Our pastor left after about 9 months. We filled pulpit supply for a while, and then in I don't know what it was, Tom, not November 2021, we asked Tom to come in and just kind of candidate with us. He just stepped right in, did a wonderful job. We hired him very quickly, came in January and started. And for us, it was an excellent, wonderful experience. Tom just kind of fell right in and very personable with the congregation, strong from the pulpit. It just we just needed that pastoral care, and we needed that pastoral leadership, and Tom did a great job with that. So.
Yeah, to help you through the grieving process.
That was a big part of it, and we got to the point where we were just kind of felt like we were treading water, and we couldn't kind of move forward. We couldn't kind of do any programs. It was just we didn't have enough people to do it. People still working. It was too much, and so it helped bring someone in to just kind of help with the leadership.
Yeah, great. So Tom, what was your experience? And was this your first interim?
Yes, it was my first interim. We were connected through IPM, the very cleverly named, imaginatively named Interim Pastor Ministries. And it was just a great fit. Kishwaukee Community Church is a great church, but they were grieving. They were grieving the loss of their pastor. They were grieving the death of his wife. They were grieving what everybody else in the country in the world was grieving with the pandemic and all the upheaval and all that. So one of the first things I did is I spent a month preaching a topical series on finding hope in God's goodness, and it seemed to really resonate with where the people were at. So that was a great thing. Unlike Matt, who was extended for another half a year because they didn't want to lose him, serving this church in rural Illinois, it was expected that my interim there could last a year or two or longer. And it turned out to only be half a year because they found their next pastor in relatively short order. And Gary spearheaded the pastor search committee doing that. But it was a really great experience for me. I would do it again.
Yeah, good. At the top of the hour, I had mentioned that, especially in the PCA context, we speak of, or Book of Church Order speaks of stated supply. We don't really have a true category for interim. And I think, Tom, you had mentioned that Karen Cook at Administrator's Office has a list of those who can serve as interim, which is wonderful, but we don't think of that very often. Our churches don't. How would you describe the difference between a stated supply and an interim? What might be the distinction, and how might that be helpful?
Well, I tell you, I'll make a brief comment, and then maybe Matt can fill in here. Stated supply, they're steadying the ship. They're bringing some continuity to the teaching in the life of the church, which is very helpful, rather than just a succession of one-off standalone sermons or what have you. So that's great. It has its place, definitely. But an intentional interim pastor can do a lot more than that in working with the elder board and down the road, a search committee and all that. The three organizations that we mentioned, at least in passing here already together, Vital Church Ministry, they do their diagnostic up front before they place their interim. Interim Pastor Ministries instead administers, they have a proprietary tool of their own, of course. It's called the Ministry Insight Tool. And the interim does that when he gets on site. And maybe I'll hand it over to Matt and have him talk about how Flourish goes about assessments.
Yeah, so we did a diagnostic up front, and that's actually well studied in the literature on this, is that it's important. Interim pastors are what people in industry, Sean's probably familiar with this phrase, rare, valuable, non-substitutable. And if you have a rare, valuable, non-substitutable like an interim pastor, you want to make sure that you link them up with a church that is sort of ready to face its issues, that wants to deal with its stuff and wants to be led. And so that's super, super important. You can think about interim work, or transitional work in churches, maybe across five clicks. Paul and I have talked about this a little bit, across sort of 5 clicks of intensity. There are churches that could do just fine with a part-time person who preaches a fair bit, does a little care, makes sure that bulletins get out, things like that. And there's no necessarily any leadership that's needed. It's just sort of continuity. That might be click 1. Click 2, they might need a little bit of help with it. Maybe their elder board wants some advice, but even the interim doesn't necessarily even serve on the elder board, right? They're just, it's a little bit more intense. There might be a little bit of leadership that's needed, but that's not the expectation. Once you get to click 3, there are some things that really need to be addressed. And I think that's the space where we've not done as well, frankly, in the PCA at clicks 3, 4, and 5. There are very few people that have chosen to step into that space, but it's very much needed. So as you go from 3 to 5, clicks 3 to 5, it grows in intensity, where 5 is the guy dies in the pulpit. He has an affair. The church splits, right? And 4 is somewhere in intensity between, we do absolutely need some help and some leadership here, and it's not an absolutely crazy situation, but it's significantly challenging. And the situations that certainly that Paul and I walked towards were things that were between, I would say, between 4 and 5, if that's fair. They're not the worst they could have been, but they're definitely very challenging. So anyways, is that helpful?
Yeah, that's good. And any other thoughts from the rest of you on that?
Well, yeah, could I just comment on that? Our church went through, as I said, a number of interims. We went also through a period where we would have been like on the click one, where we went for 9-10 months where us elders filled the pulpit week to week. We basically were, trying to manage, run the church, and that worked okay. But I still feel there was a sense that we were like, I'll use the term again, treading water, and the congregation wanted, even though we were elders, they wanted a pastor. They needed a pastor. And so there is probably the rare church that can kind of manage through time, but boy, the bringing in a true an interim pastor that serves that role has been so important. And I can't recommend it, strong enough.
Yeah, I would add that we discussed interim pastor versus stated supply, and even though we greatly benefited from Matt's preaching, we have elders who have filled in and can fill in and will fill in, and being able to draw from the DC Baltimore area, we probably could have made it work, although we're much better off having Matt. But the big thing about the interim pastor was the non-preaching that Matt could also fill. Working with the session, we actually went to Presbytery and to get him permission to moderate our session while he was here, and while he is here. And it was, even though his preaching is outstanding and we've greatly benefited from the church, it was the non-pulpit aspects of the interim pastor that we needed the most.
Yeah, that focused leadership, because leadership, again, I always want to say this carefully because it's being recorded. As Presbyterians, we have this understanding of the collective aspect of the session, but having that point person, when you remove that point person, it's hard to really provide leadership only in a committee without a single point person moderating that committee. Go ahead, Paul.
Before you leave that, the comments have been great. I confirm all of those. I think just teasing that out a little bit more, the Sunday ministry and the continuity is so important, but it really is, as Bill just said there, it's between the Sundays in so many ways. If it's a larger church, right, it's your staff. It's helping the staff have continuity and care and leadership and encouragement. If there has been trauma of some kind, and as you've said, there's trauma at some level in any transition. If it's a 30-year beloved pastor who rides off into the sunset in good health, there's still the trauma of that loss. And so shepherding the congregation through that, I think just presence, willingness to have a lot of conversations in a lot of directions, and just the sense that the congregation has that someone is at the steering wheel, that someone is before the Lord in shepherding and care and leadership, having the hands on the wheel by God's grace. That's a huge part of it. Really is.
That's good. We have a question here. It's a great question. Let me read it first. What can you share about the dynamic of presbytery involvement and or support of interim pastors? How does the, quote, outside help of an interim relate to the, quote, outside help of the presbytery or its pastoral care committee? What are the benefits and pitfalls of introducing an interim into the already existing relationship between a congregation and its presbytery?
Maybe we could take a stab at that one, Sean. I'll go first. We have some unique dynamics here in that we did have a highly traumatic situation with the exit of our pastor, in which the presbytery was heavily involved. So one more layer in the renewal that we're seeking is an ongoing reconciliation process with our presbytery in that journey of our pastor's exit. And so I think having an interim has been helpful. There's one more layer of go-between there between the session and the presbytery, and helping both know one another, care one another, love one another. I will say out here, Pacific Presbytery has been just tremendous to me. There are all kinds of different models. As you said, it's so underdeveloped, this model. There's a lot of different ways to go in your presbytery relationships. I've maintained my former presbytery's relationship as a member in Tennessee Valley Presbytery, but am stated supply here and a licentiate of Pacific Presbytery, but they so have welcomed me and allowed me to be a part of their court in terms of interactions and serving on committees. And so it's been very healthy and I think very helpful. Sean, what would you add to that? Or what?
Yeah, that's well said. I think our church really had no personal relationships within the presbytery, and then with their pastor departure, I'd say the relationship was just completely broken. So I've been in 3 different presbyteries around the country, and I'm a big believer in the PCA system and the Book of Church Order, but our church wasn't really living by the Book of Church Order and following it in our governance. And I don't think our presbytery properly was applying the Book of Church Order in a lot of ways. And so there was as Paul said, it was a challenging situation, but one of the benefits that Paul had was to come in as an interim, new to the situation, and really help to bridge that gap that existed between our church and the presbytery. And we've been able to forge stronger relationships and do a lot of work within our presbytery, so that I think in future situations we would have more support and more alignment than we had in the past. And so I think that's a kind of an unexpected benefit of an interim pastor role, is to be able to come in as maybe a neutral third party in our case to help bridge that.
I would comment, Chris, just that it seems that there are more interims in the EPC, which Gary is a ruling elder in, than there are in the PCA. I mean, Matt is bringing Flourish into this sector in the PCA. But the other ministries we've mentioned today, Vital Church Ministry has no one in their smaller stable of pastors that's PCA. The largest organization that I know of, Interim Pastor Ministries, has about 150 interim pastors in their stable. Only about 5 are PCA, of which, I'm one. So it just doesn't seem to be as common a thing. Oh, there are some independent contractors too, by the way. Mike Ross did an interim not far away from where I am, outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, at Peace Presbyterian Church. So there are a few independent contractors. In fact, Paul put me in touch with a couple of other guys that were doing interims, and we're in a cohort that meets twice a month to encourage one another and pray for one another. But it seems to be more common and accepted in the EPC, and I'm glad for what Matt is doing to try to bring more attention to this in the PCA.
The EPC Book of Government clearly identifies this, right? They specify stated pulpit supply. They identify assistant pastor, interim pastor, associate pastor, pastor. They lay those categories out in the criteria and the expectations of them pretty well. So I think they've done a good job in helping to facilitate that through the presbytery. When you're talking about the relationship with the presbytery, at least in our situation, they did a very good job of helping us kind of navigate those waters and make sure we were clear about, we had 3 things going on. We had pulpit supply while we were looking to pull in an interim, while we also had our PSC going on all at once, and so we kept those things clear, and Presbytery helped us do that.
Yeah, Gary is in Rivers and Lakes Presbytery, the EPC there, and very supportive.
Chris, I think that one of the things that, and this is, again, if you read the literature on transitional ministry, this is Transitional ministry really started in about the 70s in the mainline. They just got a lot smarter about it than the conservative evangelicals did. We're kind of catching up late, if you will. And one of the things that is a hallmark of transitional ministry is trying to connect the local church back to the larger body. So this is actually, David O'Leary's question is actually a very good one, because it ought to be that the interim and the way that Paul's serving brings the church back into better relationship with the local presbytery, if possible. Where I am in Columbia, the church did not have a bad relationship with the presbytery. That wasn't one of their issues. Although it was interesting, because me coming as the Brooklyn Church Order, the PCA would put it as stated supply, but then also with the layer of being appointed as the moderator of the session. Paul, were you appointed as a moderator of the session for? Yeah. And so that was brand new. And there was a little bit of consternation because it just hadn't happened before. So even just saying, hey, this is a possible path for PCA churches where we might not have the good nuance of what the EPC has in their book, which would be better, frankly. But there's a path that you can get this done in the PCA and actually have somebody come in and lead.
That's something as you're describing this, it hadn't really occurred to me that the higher the trauma in the church, if we really are a connectional church, that trauma is going to affect their relationship with their brothers in the churches, sisters in the other churches. Especially if there's been some division over, a departing pastor or what have you. So yeah, coming in, and you're not usurping the pastoral care committee in that sense, because you don't have the authority to do that, but you're coming in as, again, that outside voice to talk it through, which tells me that interim pastor, and Matt, you're talking about those 5 clicks. If you're talking, especially 4 and 5, that interim pastor better have some good skill in doing the proper polity 2-step in a healthy way to walk
100%
without being forceful. No, I think that's a great point. Thanks. Other question here that came up was your comments about division, conflict, misunderstanding, or striking a chord. Their teaching elder announces resignation due to unfortunate circumstances. We don't have an assistant or an associate. Thank you for your resources. Where do we start?
Yeah, I would. Yeah.
I'll
toss one, Chris. I think what a great question. I appreciate that. I think a great place to start is prayer. Not to sound trite in any way, but we've even made the theme for our church going forward that we're begging the Lord to make us a house of prayer for all peoples, for all situations. And I think just starting with a humble prayer, I think what I've seen in our elders here and in our staff here, and it really has worked its way down to our people here, is a growing humility in the situation. We are broken. We are all broken. We are all needy. There's a fresh sense of knowing we need the gospel. We need the Lord's grace in every space deeply. And so there's just been a spiritual health that has come out of, I think, that gospel humility and prayer. And then stepping forward from there, I think looking to a resource like Matt and Flourish or some of the other groups that we've mentioned, just to come and have a conversation. One of the great things about Matt is he's not going to try to sell you something. He's going to come in and try to help you and really help assess where you are. And Matt is so good at saying, this is something we could do with Flourish, or maybe another direction is better for you. Or just talking, people like Tom or myself. I mean, I'm one of those independent contractors that felt called to leave a post to come do this. I'm always happy to talk and share about my experience, but I think groups like Matt and Flourish are a great place. But I wouldn't start there. I'd start first with prayer.
I would.
That's just, yeah.
I would echo that completely. When our pastor left, it was we found out in late June, early July of 21. We did not contact Flourish until September to start working. This is something that the Lord calls us to. And in Acts 2, we know that the early church was devoted to prayer, and we saw how God worked, and we spent substantial time praying, and that's what you really need to do. So I would echo that. Many times people want to jump to action right away, and that doesn't seem to be the scriptural model. The scriptural model is prayer before anything. And but I reiterate what was said, looking for organizations. And we looked at other groups, and I'll put a shameless plug in for Flourish, because they offered more for about half the price from other places we looked. I know I don't want to talk about money, but money's a reality. Some churches, when they go through trauma, people leave, and the resources aren't always there. And the thing I liked about Flourish is that they not only came with a very good reputation, and God had used them already in our presbytery, and so we were familiar, but they offer a wide variety of services that you can piecemeal. And if your church just doesn't have the finances for all of it, they help you decide what is best for you, even if it's not them. And that integrity is hard to find, even in Christian organizations sometimes. And that was very encouraging to us, because they were able to meet us where we were, and help us to figure out of all the many needs we had, where do we start? That's another thing that was invaluable, because they when trauma like this happens, the congregation very much wants a new pastor. They want the new pastor to fix everything. And Flourish really helped us to understand, no, there are things you need to do before you bring in that new pastor. Otherwise, the new pastor is not going to stay, most likely. And that was extremely valuable. But it took an education. We had to educate the session, and we had to educate the congregation on that point.
We should probably move on to another question, but I think that the last thing I'd say for this one, Chris, is that I think what a church in their situation, they just have to have a shared view of reality. They've got to have a clear idea together. What do we need? And if it is an interim, then let's try and move towards that. So
yeah, no, it's good. Daniel McKinney asked a question about being an interim for those of us that are ordained in PCA in another denomination. Now, Tom, PCA, we're doing an interim in the EPC. Daniel was wondering about being asked as an interim in a CRC church. He said, "What are the first things that need to happen within the first few weeks? I mean, how does that operate? Because we can become pretty brand loyal, brand specific, and I don't know if it's a concern within a presbytery or personal. But what are your thoughts there, operating in other contexts?"
Well, I typed a brief written response. Adopting a listening posture, I think, is so important, because, again, you're beginning to serve a congregation that has reached out for that third-party, impartial sort of mediator, and they've experienced some level of loss or trauma. And you need to not go in with, I mean, even though you're going to maybe do your diagnostic or assessment up front, which is a listening tool, right? It's a tool to give you data that reflects what the congregation is telling you. But I think it's important to realize that we enter into that situation with briefcase credibility, right? We're an outsider, so we must be an expert. But the humility and prayer and brokenness that Paul referred to, and then adopting that listening posture where you're listening to the elders, you're listening to the staff, you're listening to women, right? Women help us round out the picture. But it's important for the staff to let you know what it's like for them. And so you're trying to build a relationship of trust in a short time. But the way that you can do that is by being real, not coming off as a know-it-all, being approachable, and entering into their situation.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think Tom's answer is great. Daniel, good to hear from you. But if it is a situation, I know Chris, we haven't gotten there yet. And if we're pivoting a little bit, like, do I have to move to the place? Do I, the different kinds of interims and the different kinds of dynamics, and everybody here has done it a little differently, even in this threesome. Tom kind of moved to the place and then would go home occasionally. Matt is there as part of his world, many faceted world, regularly in the Baltimore area. And then Fran and I picked up stakes and completely moved out here, for this season. So they're all different. But I think if it is something that's more localized, whether you're able to do something more locally and be very present, or you do choose to move, just the time, Daniel, as you get started, or any of us, to just listen, as Tom said, to be present, to have a lot of coffees and lunches, to be available. I'm very gifted at not following best practices. A lot of times I can preach them and not follow them. Those that know me can chuckle at that. But you hear always a best practice for interim pastors: preach things that you have in place, preach to need, but preach things that you have in place. I think that's very good. I have not done that here for a number of reasons. But the space that you need to just be with people, the leaders, the staff, the larger dynamics of the presbytery is so important. So I think just being on the ground and present is huge.
There's that balance, I think, between that listening, which is kind of a look back, right? It's
Right.
reflecting, revisiting the past trauma and genuinely entering in, but then helping the church begin to look forward and to recognize that there is hope, there is direction, there is purpose, there is meaning ultimately in Christ and the gospel. And there is a blessed future, perhaps, for the church. So to get them moving forward too, because a mistake that so many churches make, and Matt's an expert on this, by the way, I've learned this from him, is the organizational life cycle of the church. And if the church is on kind of a little bit of a downward trend, churches tend to want to stay there sometimes and to kind of romanticize the past, the heyday of the church, the good old days. It wasn't this great when we used to do this. And you can learn from that, but you've got to encourage the people to move forward together with what Matt said earlier about, what would you say, Matt, a dose of reality or
shared view of reality.
Yeah, no.
Yep.
But Matt, tell us describe the, I don't want to say the ideal interim, but what are the qualities you're looking for? How much experience do they need? I'm 31. I'm not really 31. You can tell that. But I'm 31, and I was ordained last year, but I want to do interim work. Or kind of help us think through what are you looking for in an interim?
Yeah, when we're looking for an interim, I think that we're looking for several qualities. I think that the first one, and Gary, I think, pointed this out, is and you've heard this from the elders that have been on here, is the guy actually needs to be a more than competent preacher. The church needs vital pulpit, life-giving ministry when the guy's there. It's just it's a non-essential. It's an absolute essential. Okay. I think the second thing is that he's got to have good leadership skills. We'll link in the show notes some work from Vital Church, who I have great respect for. Basically asking you to self-evaluate: would I be a good interim? It's a self-evaluation, but the questions are the right ones to be asking yourself. And so those will be in the show notes, and you'll be able to see that. You can ask yourself. Leadership nuance, I think, is probably the next thing that I'm looking for. It takes a degree of leadership skill, facility, the ability to walk towards the right conflicts and to do them in the right ways, right? And not leave things unresolved. A gentleman who used to work for me used to say that the role, this kind of role, is to solve problems and leave them solved, keep them solved. And so that's what you're there. You're there to solve the problems and to help keep them solved, because you've created a different ethos, right? I think it's got to be personable. It takes a lot of energy to do it. It really does. There's a lot of movement towards people. And I think that sometimes pastors some pastors, they're able to let things come to them and be able to do a very successful pastoral ministry in that way. This is a lot of, and maybe Tom and you probably chime in on this, but it's a lot of moving towards people. It's a lot of initiating conversations that need to happen.
Bridge building.
What's
building.
that?
Bridge building.
Yeah, bringing people back together again, meeting with, in my situation, meeting with different elders and getting perspectives and trying to bridge something where we have a shared view of reality and a shared plan to move forward. So that's at least a beginning list.
I'll just toss, Chris, just quickly, a couple points. It's important to remember in interim ministry, like any role of ministry, is that different people are going to do it different ways. There's not a way to do it. Matt and I often joke. I mean, he's a Ben Hogan person. He is going to do it systematically, and he's got great structures and plans, and he follows those beautifully in a relational way. I'm more of a Ben Crenshaw person. I do it all by feel. I don't have plans necessarily. I have macro ideas. I have huge driving principles underneath things and concepts and vision, but it's very by feel for me and very organic. And so I think that can be done in different ways in different situations, different gifts. I will say that you were joking, but I do think that interim work is often best done as sort of what we talk about in the phases of life, as a coalescing phase, that you're bringing lots of experiences from lots of spaces and bringing it to this. There's sort of every call is like this, right? But I think uniquely these interim calls ought to feel like Esther kind of moments, that everything kind of in my background has been a part of God placing me in this unique space for this time. And so I do think it's one of those good spaces where maybe it's an older person's game more, it's good for us older guys. So,
yeah. I think you need a guy that I would say it's at least his third call. I think the first call you figure out how much you don't know. The second call, maybe you begin to learn the things that you thought you knew that you didn't know, but you needed to learn. And maybe by the third call, you're actually productive, right? So I think it's got to be at least a third call. Later 40s, into I think for me, I would say there are people who are 65 that play young. There are also people that are 65 where younger people in a church would be like, really? We have this guy for the next year? And I wish it wasn't that way, because there are a lot of 65-year-old pastors that churches could really gain value from, but it is the perception game too. So it's difficult, but that's my basic heuristic, age and experience wise, right? You look at Mike Ross; it's well beyond that, and has had productive interims, 3 of them that I know of, right? And so you can bust all that, but Mike also plays young.
Terry Geiger in his 70s. It's some of the best
70s,
interim work we have in our history of PCM.
Yeah.
Where
so
Flourish. What I was going to say was where Flourish and some of these other groups we've mentioned today can help is with the assessment piece, that diagnostic piece, because like Paul, I tend to be more organic in my approach, and I serve alongside Matt with Flourish, and I have come to appreciate his systems and processes and using an instrument to gain that feedback and information from the congregation that then you can tell the people, this is what you're saying, this is what we are hearing from you. And I see great value in that.
Now, someone had asked about what about a lifelong associate? They've not been in a senior role. Are there factors there?
I think they could be great. I think it is very situational. If it is, it could cut a number of ways. If they've been an associate in a larger church, They understand staff dynamics well. They understand connectivity between session and staff and people well. They could perhaps serve very well in an interim in a larger setting, or it could cut the other way and they're very, very people oriented. And maybe it's a smaller church where the real need is just a space where there's faithful, regular preaching and presence, and they may be great at that.
Right.
I wouldn't discount somebody at all who's sort of more primarily an associate.
That's good. I want to ask the ruling elders, to what degree did you engage the session in the process? Is this something that you just you announced to them? Did you kind of prepare them for this? Was there pushback? What are your thoughts?
The congregation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think for us, we tried to engage. We didn't engage the full congregation. We didn't embark on that. I mean, there's a whole pulpit search, pastoral search committee process and everything outlined in the BCO, which we're going through now, and Paul's helping with us with that, which has been a big benefit. So in the interim role, we had some interim candidates meet with the diaconate, with staff members of our church. I think we had about 15 people on staff at the time. So we had some, and then maybe a couple of other key leaders, but we didn't engage the entire congregation. I think we felt like, just given with where our church was, especially, we sort of bore the burden, this responsibility that we wanted to find the right interim pastor for the right reason. And the congregation had not been through this before. I think we were all learning as we were going, but I think there was a lot of wisdom from a lot of the advice we were getting from outside advisors and counselors that were helping us to understand what is the role of an interim pastor. And I don't even think our congregation or our session understood that at the beginning. And what we've come to learn and really appreciate. One of the questions here was, what percentage of the time would it behoove churches to consider an interim pastor? And I'm kind of the mindset now that I would say every time. One of the things we learned was that to really set the stage for your next senior pastor to be successful, having a period of lowering the temperature, kind of resetting expectations, getting some separation between a prior pastor and a new pastor. There's a lot of benefit to that for the next person to fill a more permanent call. And so having that period of time in the middle, and we thought it was 6 months, and Paul and others said you really need it to be at least a year, and sometimes more than that, to create that separation. That's really benefited our church.
We had a very similar situation, including many of the congregation thinking it was going to be 6 months, and we had to educate them that no, it's going to be a year to 18 months probably. But the session did not really engage the congregation too much about our decision to get Flourish and then to have Matt as our interim. But one of the things we did do once our senior pastor left is commit ourselves that session to update and keep the congregation informed much more regularly than we had been doing. So we did take the time and through various opportunities and a town hall and things like that to share kind of the rationale of why we why we picked an interim and how we came about getting Flourish. But it was but it was basically the work of the session that did the investigation and the eventual reaching out to Matt.
Can in our experience, we have a smaller church and they are used to understanding what's going on. They trust session, but they do like to understand. So we went maybe beyond communicating. We did very regular communications with the congregation, both on Sunday morning. We sent out letters explaining the different phases we were going through, the reason for the different phases for pulpit supply, interim, and full-time, status of each one. We did spend a lot of time communicating what we were doing, and I think our congregation appreciates that. I think they wanted to understand what's going on. So
yeah. And again, I would think it would depend on the degree and what kind of trauma the congregation's going through. Bringing them into that conversation could just exacerbate if there's division between them. No, we want this, no, we want that, and you're not helping. So I think again, it has so much that goes into it that way. Well, I want to thank you all. We've reached the hour, and want to let you guys go, but I want to appreciate your time, your insight. If you're watching, I'll be sending out the link for this. Please share it, but also at that with some show notes, a lot of the links were posted and some other articles, some good information, as well as the contact information of these six guys. You can reach out, follow up, ask them any questions as well about this. We'll be back again in 2 weeks, talking about reaching the ministry with and among South Asians here in the PCA and in North America. And it'll be a good conversation to see what the Lord is doing in that context. And until then, Lord bless. Take care. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank
Yeah.
you.